course, it costs a lot of money for the government to run a free education system. And if you're not getting the equity outcomes, which is ultimately the reason why a government would fund that system in the first place, well, there needed to be another way around it.
So I think one of the things that would be most interesting to just sort of start off with, that I think a lot of people in US audiences don't understand, is Australia used to have free college, what we would call in this country free college or free university, in the 1970s, and decided to abandon that. Let's start there.
Okay, so back in the 1970s, we had a Prime Minister called Gough Whitlam. He was a transforming, larger-than-life character, and he changed the country. He modernised Australia. And one of the things he did was introduce free university fees. And there was a feeling that people from disadvantaged backgrounds flooded into universities as a result of the free tuition fees. As it turned out, by the 1980s, the government had realised that that wasn't actually the case. The numbers increased dramatically, but it went from elite to not quite so elite. But still, it was a lot of rich kids going to universities, and the working classes hadn't exactly flooded through the doors as expected. So by the time we got to the mid-80s, we had another Labor government, this time run by Bob Hawke, and they were concerned about the fact that the poor, or the working poor, were subsidising the tuition fees of the wealthy. So they had to find a way of how to reintroduce fees without disadvantaging poor people, and also they had to keep the Gough acolytes, or the true believers, on side, because there was a lot of people who still believed that Gough was God, basically, in Australia.
So it's a little bit, I'm sure for US audiences, this is a little bit surprising, because as you may know, we're having this debate now about free college as a way to actually increase access for underrepresented, underserved students. But what you're saying is that in the 70s, when you had free tuition in Australia, it didn't produce the results to the extent that everyone thought it would in that.
There is a very strong kind of mythology among Australians of that generation, of which I'm one of them, that it did increase access. And there's a lot of people will say that they went to university because of Gough's free tuition, but the numbers just don't really stack up. There was a very strong and powerful scholarship system that preceded that. So people like me who came from the working poor would have still gone to university, and I would have been on a scholarship. I wouldn't have been disenfranchised from the system. So the problem was that it didn't increase the number of basically people in the lowest quartile, and that they were the people who were subsidising the relatively wealthy to go to university. It needed to be more equitable. And of course, it costs a lot of money for the government to run a free education system. And if you're not getting the equity outcomes, which is ultimately the reason why a government would fund that system in the first place, well, there needed to be another way around it. And it also meant that the university system couldn't grow. They couldn't go into massification. It had to remain relatively elite because they just couldn't afford to increase the number of students going.
Yeah, and I think that's a thing that we sort of miss here, is this, it's free, but only certain people get it, right? So it sounds like you're saying there's a sort of like a capacity constraint. Yeah. Because it's expensive.
Well, the franchised get it. The fortunate get it because they know how to work within the system. And if it is constrained, if the capacity is constrained, it's those people, it's the advantaged who get more advantage as a result of it.
And they have the high test scores to.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So okay. Yeah, exactly.
So this system of free starts to come under criticism in the 80s. So
well, it didn't come under criticism.
Okay.
So there was a great deal of belief in Gough and what Gough did.
Okay. The Prime Minister at the time?
The Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam. So he was only Prime Minister for 3 years in the early 1970s, from 72 to 75. And during that time, he introduced free tuition fees, universal health care, opened relations with China, bought Jackson Pollock's blue poles for £1 million, which outraged the nation indescribably. So he was very much a reforming Prime Minister, and as I said, he modernised Australia in lots and lots of ways. And there wasn't particularly a lot of backlash against tuition fees. But by the time we got to the next Labor government run by Bob Hawke, which again was another reforming government, and on the sort of the left, centrist left, I guess the equivalent of your Democrats, that they realised that there was a huge cost. They wanted to do a lot of things with the country. They wanted to modernise again, and that they realised that the cost of running a free education system stopped them also from opening up, from massifying the system. So they had to find a way to reintroduce fees without upsetting the true believers, the Whitlam believers, but also get many more people from disadvantaged backgrounds into the system.
So this is 1980s, early 80s?
Hawke was elected in 1983, I think.
Okay.
And so by the mid-80s, they were definitely talking about ways in which to massify the university system.
And I think that's interesting for U.S. audiences too. That you have a center-left, politically center-left government that is looking at the free university system and saying that this is just too limited to the enrollment. Who can enroll?
You've got to remember. This is the government that also, took unleashed the Australian dollar and put it on the free market. That also took all subsidies and tariffs off all our exports. So it was a very, very free market. Government. They once again completely transformed the nature of Australia. Modern Australia today has everything reliant on what happened during the Hawke era.
Interesting. And so is this government that sort of came to realize, and I want to see if I can get you to explain that in order to expand the number of seats that were available at universities, they were going to have to do away with the free tuition or fees, as you call them.
Absolutely. So they needed to find a way through that, but they couldn't from an ideological point of view, and they couldn't introduce full fees again, because that would just automatically send a signal to the market that poor people couldn't afford to go to university. They probably couldn't afford a big scholarship system if they wanted to massify the system. So they had to find a way through that, how to reintroduce fees without stopping poor people from going to university. And the way they did that, which I think is a piece of policy genius, and I think it's a remarkable piece of policy, is that the then education minister of the time, a guy called John Dawkins, found a young economist called Bruce Chapman, who had just arrived back in Australia with a freshly minted PhD from Yale. And together they developed something called income contingent loans. Now, they're in a number of countries now, but they were Bruce Chapman's idea. And the idea was that you could reintroduce fees, and the government would pay a certain proportion of what the fee was under what's called the Commonwealth Grant Scheme, and the students would pay another percentage of it, which meant that they had a debt, but they didn't start repaying the debt until their income hit a certain threshold.
So the Australian government continues to subsidise the universities. But now students have to pay tuition. But they actually don't have to put any money up front.
So there's no money up front, and there's a safety net. So that if you don't benefit from your university education, if you don't get a great job that pays, and the threshold was quite high.
Before you have to start paying back this loan.
Before you pay back. And so if you never get to that threshold, or you move in and out of that threshold, particularly for women who are working part-time, maybe after they've had children, that they only pay at that threshold. And the money, the other part of the genius is it's collected through the tax system. So that there is, it's a very simple system for repayment.
And this is where, I think many people in the United States, this is the part of the Australian system that they know most about, or maybe the only part that they hear about is the loan. Students get a loan, everybody can get a loan, they don't have to put any money up front to pay for college, and then they pay back based on their income.
Correct.
And only after their income reaches a certain level. But I think one thing that I think piece of context that's missing there, though, is that this form of paying tuition, sort of deferred tuition, as some people call it, was a way to bring revenue into the universities to offer more seats.
Yep.
So usually we're sort of focused on the mechanics of the loan, but I think there's still a limit to the number of seats at these universities, right? So talk about that in the 1980s.
Oh, so in the 1980s, before the introduction of income contingent loans, or what we call HECS.
Well, when the loans are introduced, who decides how many seats there are at a university?
Well, the government decided.
So explain that.
Well, it's hard to explain, really. There was a very bureaucratic system in which the government capped the number of places, gave a finite number of places in every single course in every single university in Australia. And that was obviously a lot of courses. And if universities went above or below, I think it was about 5%, they were then fined by the government for not meeting this exact number. So that it was incredibly bureaucratic and stupid, really, because if a university had a really great law program, but a really ordinary science program, it couldn't enrol more students in its law degree where the demand was. They might have people clambering to get into their law degree and no one wanting their science degree, but they couldn't move places between those two systems. So they were stuck with what the government assigned. I'm not really au fait with how negotiations went between universities and the government, but I get the impression that they probably weren't very constructive. And it was called Moscow on the Molonglo being a river in Canberra and Moscow being a Soviet.
So so there's sort of being this complaint that sure we have this very sensible solution to the too few places under the free system.
Yes.
So we have this sensible solution, very practical, where Australia is going to give people income-based loans, where they pay back the loan based on a share of their income. This will bring in the revenue. There'll be more places available at the universities, which all seems like a great idea. But I think what gets lost in the conversation is that, as you're describing it, even with these reforms, the government at this time was essentially determining how many majors, how many science majors, how many biology majors you could have at a certain university in a given year.
And ultimately, how many were being released, at the end of 3 years, because we got a 3-year undergraduate system, onto the market after that. So, it was highly controlled and probably not very scientific at all. Right. But that meant the government could control costs. It knew exactly how much the higher education sector was going to cost it every single year.
I think that's key. Right? I think that's key. That this is a form of rationing, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So it's a heavily subsidized system, but it's expensive. Even with the income contingent
It's not
loan.
as subsidised as it was, though, under free
we'll
education.
And that's where we're headed. By the way, I think in the United States, what people will be shocked to know that Australia used to limit how many bachelor's degrees you could have, as a way of controlling costs, as you said. But this, so flash forward to sort of 2005, 2006, 2007, and I remember this era very well, where it's sort of, there's a global economic boom, and even in the United States, everybody is talking about global competitiveness, right? And China's producing so many engineers, and everybody's going to have a bachelor's degree, and we need to compete. And when I look at what was happening in Australia around the same time, it looks like a similar theme. And there's a desire again for more capacity at universities. Do I have that? Is that a fair?
Kind of.
Okay.
So it was capped. Once again, we got another Labor government after years of 11 years of John Howard government, a Conservative government. And then in 2007, we had the Kevin Rudd government get elected in. Kevin 07 was the T-shirt logo. And once again, the country was very wealthy. We'd made a lot of money out of digging iron ore out of the ground and shipping it off to China. So there was a lot of money in the system. Once again, university places were capped, so we weren't producing more graduates for the system. And what happened in 2007 is that Rudd's education minister was Julie Gillard, later Prime Minister. Later Prime Minister, and who commissioned a review by a former university vice-chancellor called Denise Bradley. And that review came up with 46 recommendations.
A review of the higher education system.
A review of the higher education system, because obviously there were problems, right? About capacity building. So
still concerns about capacity around 2006 and 2007.
Well, yeah, because of the change in government. So they needed they just needed to throw some fresh light on what was going on. So Denise Bradley undertook a major review, and she came up with a number of recommendations, the chief of which was that university undergraduate places for domestic students be uncapped.
So her recommendation is we have to lift these caps that the government has in place. So who decides who gets in?
The universities decide who gets in. So universities in Australia are self-accrediting. I guess like the American system, they decide how many people they enrol and what the academic standards of the people coming in have.
So this is a recommendation that comes out of this review of the higher education system.
It's called the Bradley Review.
The Bradley Review, okay. And now in the U.S. we have lots of panels and commissions and reports and reviews, and nobody does anything with them. They sit on shelves. But what happened in this case with the Bradley?
Well, what happened in this case is they got to work very quickly. Julia Gillard was an extraordinarily effective education minister. Got to remember she was also running women. She had the portfolio for women. I think she had the portfolio for industrial relations and for all the education sectors. She was incredibly productive. And they got to work and they started implementing the recommendations of the Bradley Review. I think they ended up actually meeting about half the recommendations, and a few of them got wound back fairly quickly, but and chief among those other targets. So Bradley also set a couple of targets. One was that she wanted 40% of people aged 25 to 34 with a bachelor's degree by 2020, and 20% of what we call SES, so low socioeconomic students, so financially disadvantaged students in the university sector by 2022.
Okay, and so the goal here, and so it's more bachelor's degrees because they've been capped, and more access for low-income students from low-income families.
So there was a very strong equity dimension to this. It was a very strong equity dimension. And also, just increasing the number of places, because, what Bradley saw was the knowledge economy coming down. It was, before we started talking about the fourth industrial revolution and Industry 2.0, but we could see that there was going to be a need for more people with bachelor's degrees in the sector. Australia is a very despite the amount of iron ore and coal we dig out of the ground, we're a very services-oriented society, and we're a very urbanised society. And so we needed more people with bachelor's degrees. So that's what they saw, and that's what they were aiming for.
And the solution to that problem is to remove the sort of centrally controlled caps from the government and let universities decide. And this is called the demand-driven system.
It's called the demand-driven system.
So sort of sounds very market-oriented. And although I'll remind our listeners that the universities are still universities would now be in charge. I think sort of so there are some people watching who would say, oh well, 6 of one, half a dozen the other. The government's setting caps, the university's setting it. What have you really solved? But this does seem like a radical change in how this is done. But so students though would still be able to get these loans.
Students could still get their income contingent loans.
Okay.
Yep.
And so describe how this system starts to roll out then.
Okay, so they started uncapping places in 2010 onwards.
Okay. And
so what they did for the first 2 years was allowed universities to increase by 10%, and they would pay the Commonwealth Grant Scheme and also the HEX contingent of that.
The loans, the HEX of the
loans. of that by 10%. But universities could enrol as many as they wanted. They just wouldn't get the government contribution. They would just get the student contribution.
So sort of a phase-in to start.
So it was a phase-in.
Okay.
And the first year went, fine, a bit quietly. A couple of universities were a bit enthusiastic. By the next year, a number of them were getting quite enthusiastic because they realised that by the time you got to year 3 that they would have the full amount. So by 2012, the caps came off completely.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching part 1 of our discussion with Julie Hare. If you enjoyed what you saw, remember to like the video or leave us a comment. And if you want to see more, check out part 2.